The Titanic. Behind the story of the most legendary ocean liner lies a little-known tale of the adventurous, pioneering men determined to push the limits of the possible. Their incredible technical achievement in the shipyards of Ireland included the construction of not just one, but 3 ocean liners, the largest in the world at the time.
They really were planning on way larger ships than anybody had ever seen.
Imagine being on a mission to Mars or something. That'd be the closest thing we can come to today.
They really thought that they could potentially conquer nature.
Think you know all there is to know about the Titanic? Think again, and watch as we reveal some of the intriguing, overlooked backstory of history's most famous ocean liner. It all started in 1908 at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast with the construction of a massive, revolutionary building framework. For nearly 3 years, 6,000 people dedicated their lives to making the crazy dream of creating these colossal vessels come true.
Building the slipway and the gantry was a massive undertaking.
They need to make these changes because it's simply not possible to build these ships.
The Titanic's epic adventure started with its first rivet. The hull alone took 2 years to build. It sprang from the farsightedness of bold, visionary men and new cutting-edge tools and techniques.
The jaws of this sea clamp would compress these rivets together, perfectly compress them, fill the holes up.
When the Titanic was built, everything was designed and made by hand.
The slightest error could compromise the actual quality, stability, and operation of the ship itself.
The ship's launch was an international event, carrying tremendous risk. The thrilling culmination of a formidable technical challenge with no room for error.
Titanic's size is unprecedented, so they don't really know 100% what may or may not go wrong.
For 60 seconds, they get to see the largest object moving on its own for the first time.
And the saying is, if a ship can survive its launch, it will survive anything.
They don't say that anymore, but while it lasted, the ship was spectacular. Now, through exceptional 3D reconstructions, extraordinary colorized footage, animations based on historical photos, and insights from the world's leading experts on the Titanic, we're about to embark on a tour of the ocean liner of the century. All aboard the Titanic, Genesis of a Giant. Belfast, Northern Ireland. This is where the story of the world's most infamous ship began more than 110 years ago, at a turning point in modern history. In the early 20th century, the world was fascinated by the idea of the American dream. Thousands of people dreamed of trying their luck in the new world full of promise. The only way to reach America was by one of the most dangerous routes known to man, the North Atlantic Ocean.
It's hard for us to imagine this, but outer space was unthinkable in those days. So really, the outer space of that time was the Atlantic Ocean.
The Atlantic Ocean is seen as the end of the world, like there's nothing beyond it. But as immigrants, there's freedom, there's choices.
To get across the Atlantic, you couldn't get in a jet plane. They didn't exist yet. To get across the ocean was the ocean liners.
In this context, with such high demand, the European and American shipbuilding industries were growing quickly. Maritime companies competed with one another to offer the largest, fastest ocean liners on the market.
There was a race for whatever country could create the fastest ship. But at some point, technology just kind of eclipsed the progress of the public utilities.
They really thought that they could potentially conquer nature. Bigger is better. The more people you could fit on a ship, the greater the profit, and so the ambition was virtually unending for size, scale, and speed.
Two British companies dominated the market, White Star and Cunard. These two competitors were locked in a fierce battle to beat records and attract as many passengers as possible, wealthy and immigrants alike. In 1907, Cunard introduced two monsters of the ocean, liners whose size, weight, speed, and capacity were unprecedented, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. With these two giants of the sea, the crossing from Southampton to New York took less than 6 days, a new record. This astounding human and technological exploit was a bombshell for their competitor, the White Star Line. Management knew they couldn't beat Cunard's advertised speed of 27 knots, the equivalent of 50 kilometers per hour.
White Star are worried. Lusitania is the fastest ship in the world. It has revolutionary turbine technology. White Star don't think they can compete, so they don't look to speed. Instead, they turn to size, luxury, and safety.
They're going to give you luxury and stability and a lovely calm ship, and they're going to make them the biggest in the world so that you'll feel that you're special when you're traveling on them.
That is why they look to building the Olympic-class ship.
Olympic-class ships. This dizzying, unprecedented project involved the construction of 3 ocean liners 30 meters longer than the Lusitania or the Mauretania, at 270 meters long, 28 meters wide, and 53 meters tall from the keel to the tops of the funnels. All this with a total capacity of 3,500 passengers and crew members, weighing more than 52,000 tons, the equivalent of 180 Airbus A380 planes. These 3 ships would be the longest, heaviest, and largest ever built.
They really were planning on way larger ships than anybody had ever seen. They really were exceptional ocean liners.
This is an absolutely monster project in every regard.
Their construction was made possible by American banker John Pierpont Morgan, who spent more than £1.5 million sterling at the time, the equivalent of $150 million today, on each of the 3 liners. Although these steel giants were designed by British architects Alexander Carlisle and Thomas Andrews, they came from the minds of 2 men. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star Line, and William Peary, the greatest shipbuilder in the world.
Peary has this great ambition to be the man to make the first 1,000-foot-long ship. They come up with names, arguably competing with Cunard's use of Roman province names. White Star turns to the Greek and the great gods. You have Olympic, and of course their great rival, the Titans, Titanic.
The first 2 Olympic-class ships were built at the same time, with work on the 3rd beginning once the first was put into service. Their ultimate goal was to have enough ships in service in order to offer weekly transatlantic crossings.
That was the ideal. So you wanted ships going both directions simultaneously for consistency in passenger trade.
Once every week, you could take one of these great liners. It would be in New York once every week. They would just rotate them out.
The construction of these gigantic ocean liners was entrusted to the leading experts of the time, the Harvard and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland. For 50 years, these shipbuilding pros had used their imagination to push the limits of technology and make people's wildest dreams come true by building floating palaces that grew more extreme in size each year.
If you didn't work in Harland and Wolff, your nearest relatives did. Everybody knew someone who worked in Harland and Wolff. It is like its own city.
It's like GM in Detroit. Most of the people that live in Detroit work for car manufacturers. Well, most of the people in Belfast work for Harland and Wolff. That's a lot of people.
before they could start work on the project, the experts at Harland and Wolff had to completely rethink their shipyard. They reconfigured their infrastructure to be able to build these juggernauts of the sea.
Just getting the shipyard ready was a massive undertaking in itself. They had to build gigantic pieces of infrastructure in order to be able to build the Titanic.
The existing shipyard is modern and it's one of the largest in the world. Nonetheless, they need to make these changes because it's simply not possible to build these ships.
The length of these ships was so extreme that there was no slipway in the world that was large enough. The engineers at Harland and Wolff were forced to destroy 3 existing slipways and replace them with 2 giant new ones. At 260 meters long and 80 meters wide, the size of 3 football fields, they were the largest slipways ever constructed, large enough to build the Titanic and the Olympic side by side.
It is the first time that 2 such large ships are built together in the same shipyard at the same time. This challenge is enormous.
The timing of the entire project depended on this first massive undertaking. The Olympic and the Titanic were due to go into service in the summer of 1911 and spring of 1912. Even the smallest mistake could have catastrophic consequences.
Once the shipyard had announced the ship would be ready to go into service on a certain date a few years in the future, they had to stick to that deadline.
The construction of these floating palaces consisted of 3 major phases. First, the building of the hull, the most time-consuming step. Second, the launch, a complex step. And finally, the fitting out of the ship's interior.
So the highest technology that they had, the greatest technology, went into the ocean liners.
The construction of the 2 vessels required the invention of a revolutionary gantry capable of lifting large pieces of metal above the 30-meter high hull. The engineers entrusted this task to architect William Arrow, the Gustave Eiffel of Britain. The construction of massive ships called for massive tools. The architect designed the largest steel structure in the world.
So William Arrow is the man who's put in charge. He's given the contract, and within a couple of years, he delivers a structure which is unrivaled, so much so that it was used right up until the late 1960s.
An incredible 70 meters tall, this gigantic metal gantry weighing 6,000 tons straddled the slipways where the Titanic and the Olympic were being built. It was composed of a movable central crane and 10 electric cranes on rails, each capable of lifting up to 5 tons.
You have cranes to do the heavy lifting, to lift huge big pieces of steel plate into position. You have lifts so that the workers can get up to the top. You've got all sorts of mechanical ways of getting people and things from place to place.
The Arrow gantry was like a small city in itself. There were hundreds of people working there every day.
Like a domino effect. One domino knocking down another domino, just to get to the point of to be able to start building these things.
March 22nd, 1909. Work on the Titanic could finally begin. Nearly 14,000 people were employed at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. 6,000 of them would end up working on building the ocean liners of the century. By the time construction on the Titanic began, work on the Olympic had been underway for 3 months. In the neighboring slipway, specially designed wooden blocks had been put in place in preparation for building to begin. These blocks would be used to build the first part of the ship, the keel.
The first step in building a ship is to lay the keel. It is a symbolic moment, a bit like laying the first brick on a building.
This is quite literally the backbone of the ship. If you imagine the spine in a skeleton, everything hinges on this particular part. It needs to be absolutely straight, absolutely level. It's imperative to get this correct.
The keel was composed of several laminated steel beams assembled at the bottom of the slipway. These beams formed an immense metallic bar 50 centimeters wide and extending the entire length of the ship.
The keel, this central piece, is really the foundation for the entire boat.
2 months later, a new phase began, one that would determine the solidity and the safety of the ship, the construction of the double bottom. This double layer of metal boxes was a formidable shield against a ship's greatest enemy, flooding.
A few decades earlier, they had realized the key to keeping ships afloat. In the case of a hole in the hull, there had to be a way to keep water from getting into the rest of the ship, or it would sink.
If anything happened, if you hit a rock, you could simply be towed off of it. You wouldn't sink. You go back to the shipyard, they repair the bottom, you'd be fine.
That safety element really defines the Olympic-class project to get these ships as safe as possible and to utilize these newer ideas to ensure the safety of Titanic.
The construction of this double bottom was quite a challenge. The metallic pieces were assembled using a technique called riveting.
Riveting was the superglue of its day. If it's metal, it was riveted.
When they built the Titanic Olympic, such a big ship, they used the same techniques as other smaller ships, but not really sure how it's all going to turn out.
3 million rivets were used to build the Titanic. 1/3 of them were put in place using cutting-edge technology. This enormous machine, a hydraulic riveter.
This is a new technology using giant pincers supported from an overhead crane. They're very fast, very efficient. It creates a very strong rivet, a very tight bond.
They would put these into pre-punched holes, and the big C-clamp, the jaws of this C-clamp would compress these rivets together, perfectly compress them, fill the holes up.
It was very expensive, but it ensured the rivets were put into place correctly.
July 1909. 5 months after the construction began, the men started building the body of the ship, putting enormous frames into place. In shipbuilding, these are known as ribs. They provided the support structure for the steel sheets of the Titanic's hull.
Frames, also known as ribs, literally like the ribs in a skeleton. They perform the same process. They create the shape of the hull, but also it is, of course, the main structural element, which, of course, everything else links into.
The rib cage of the Titanic was composed of 300 pairs of 20-meter-high ribs. These ribs were a work of art. First, they were meticulously designed by the shipyard's engineers. The next part of the job was entrusted to an army of draftsmen who had to turn the schematics into life-size pieces of metal in this hangar the size of a football field.
All the pieces were designed, calculated, and built in a massive room at the Harland and Wolff shipyard using chalk. In the time of the Titanic, everything was designed and made by hand.
And the frames are drawn out on wooden boards, which are clamped together. They're chalked out, and then they're scribed with a special knife. And it's this process where they check the lines plan to make sure that all the lines intersect at full scale properly, so that when they actually create the frames fit together where they're supposed to.
Any distraction could be massive in terms of consequence. The slightest error, particularly when you're converting scale drawings to the life-size, the potential for error could translate into faulty parts of the ship. At best, this wastes time, but at worst, it could compromise the actual quality, stability, and operation of the ship itself.
And these pieces had to be put in place with the utmost care, otherwise the consequences would be catastrophic. The risk was that the ship could become unstable and tip over inside the slipway or when launched into the water.
So when you're putting these frames in place, 66 feet tall, these are not small pieces of metal, you want to ensure that you're fitting them levelly to get the shape done correctly, symmetrically, but also to ensure the stability of the vessel on the slipway as you're building it.
Ships are not built to be on land. The taller the structure gets, the more its center of gravity moves, which presents a new challenge to overcome. The hull must be kept very straight or be subject to dramatic consequences.
If a ship were to fall over during the construction process, particularly in the confines of, say, the gantry, the amount of damage which it would do, quite aside from the risk to those actually working there, could have been absolutely catastrophic, not just for the ship itself, but for the gantry and for the immediate area around.
So they supported the structure of the ship with massive wooden beams to reinforce and hold the ship in place inside the slipway.
You can't point a laser, you can't just electronically make it happen. These guys with a pencil and a saw are going to have to work off the plans that they've been given by the draftsmen and make sure that they have this absolutely inch perfect.
At the same time, the workers put the interior frame of the vessel into place. Hundreds of metal columns and crossbeams reinforced the hull of the Titanic.
You have to imagine it like a sort of massive grid with pillars to help the ship keep its shape. Otherwise, the hull would quickly become deformed.
It all is a process, you know, that all works together. You can't just put up the shell plates without putting internals up to hold it up.
April 1910. More than a year after the keel was laid, the structure of the Titanic's hull was finally complete. It was now ready to be covered in its metal casing. This sheath was composed of 2,000 sheets of steel. The largest measured 10 meters long by 2 meters wide, and they were an average of 3 centimeters thick. Each sheet weighed nearly 4 tons. These rectangular sheets came from the best steelworks in Ireland and Scotland.
Steel is used and tested to the highest standards of Lloyd's Classification Society to make sure that the steel is of the right quality and the right strength to use on such a large ship.
Titanic's metalwork was perfectly acceptable for the day. It was about as good as you could possibly get.
Once the sheets arrived at the Harland and Wolff shipyard, they were sent to the workshop, where holes were drilled in them with the utmost precision. These holes were meant to be filled by the rows of rivets that would render the Titanic's hull perfectly watertight.
You have two metal plates overlapping each other, and they have holes in them, and you line up the holes, and then you put a red-hot rod through there.
Two million wrought iron rivets were set up using the traditional method of manual riveting. This meticulous work was done by teams of hand-picked professionals whose reputation and expertise were recognized around the world, the riveters.
The riveting gangs have a very difficult task, and as such, they are highly respected, like the leading figures in the film.
And a good riveter was worth their weight in gold. These men were paid per rivet that they put in.
The teams were often made up of 5 people. Each person had a specific role to play. Speed was key to their success. The riveters had a very narrow window, just 10 seconds to put each rivet in place on the hull before the metal would change temperature.
If it goes below the correct temperature, it won't seat properly, and they'll have wasted their time, which not only wastes materials, delays construction.
Two years after the keel was laid, the Titanic's hull was finally complete. The upper bridges were finished. The internal structure was fully assembled. It was perfectly watertight. It was an incredible feat. There was no man-made structure like it in the world.
I was a young boy, John Parkinson, whose father worked on Titanic, and as a Sunday treat, he was taken down to see the new ship Titanic. And as he stood there, he looked in both directions and he could not see an end to the ship. It was just so massive, it blotted out the sky. And he asked his father, how can such a big ship stand up in the water? His father replied, son, that big ship will always stand up in the water.
You claim that you can fix this radio Total tune-in programs that were broadcast 20 years ago.
May 31st, 1911. The Titanic's hull was about to enter the water for the first time. The cream of Belfast society and its leading personalities were invited to celebrate the event. International media outlets were on the scene to immortalize the launch of the largest ocean liner in the world.
Launch day. This is a major day for Belfast. This is like a space shuttle launch. People around the world are interested.
About 100,000 people are lining the banks to watch as Titanic comes off the slipway. They've paid a shilling to do so.
It was the result of many months of work. It was a bit like the official baptism of the boat.
The launch was a moment of great tension for the designers of the ship. The Titanic was an immense shell weighing 24,000 tons. This crucial step would confirm whether or not it was built correctly, and as such, the designers watched with some concern.
Launching something that's heavier than anything you've ever launched before, and certainly bigger than anything that's ever been launched, will it end up upright?
Is it going to be a triumph? Is it going to demonstrate just how successful the future prospects of this ship are going to be? Or is it going to be an embarrassment? Reputations are on the line here.
In order to prevent such a catastrophe, the operation was planned down to the last detail. First, the workers would remove the wooden block supporting the Titanic's hull, a delicate operation.
They had to remove the elements holding the boat in place at the last moment, and in exactly the right order, so the ship would remain stable until the last possible moment.
A poor man got his legs trapped underneath a couple of days before launch when they were knocking away the staging, and that he died from the injuries. Some people say she wasn't launched in champagne, she was launched in the blood of that man, James Dobbin.
Before it was even launched, the Titanic already had blood on its hands. A total of 17 workers died during the construction of the biggest ocean liners of the century, 8 of them on the Titanic alone. The only things left holding the hull in place were 2 hydraulic jacks. But even though the hull rested on a slipway with an inclined floor, the engineers still had to ensure it would slide into the Logan River according to plan.
Gravity, of course, is going to do the vast majority of the work, but there's a lot of friction. So they coat the slipway with 22 tons of soap, oil, and tallow. Apparently it smells disgusting, but it's just the amount of lubrication which is needed.
It was 12:13 p.m., the hour of truth. All traffic on the Logan River was brought to a halt. Distress flares signaled the departure. Silence fell beneath the aero gantry.
When the signal goes for the launch to take place, the hydraulic is released, this hook folds back down again, and there's nothing holding Titanic back. This piece drops down, which of course is the final brake holding Titanic.
And then the weight of the ship just pushes it down to the water. Really, the launch was, you'd hold your breath.
To come from a city like Belfast on the edge of Europe, you have the biggest man-made object ever moved, sliding down that slipway. That is an amazing thing to get your head around.
At that point, it is the largest moving object in the world, and they know it. And so for 60 seconds, they get to see the largest object moving on its own for the first time.
The launch went exactly according to plan, as hundreds of people looked on in fascination. The hull reached a speed of 12 knots, a danger in itself.
If if you're going to launch a 24,000-ton ship, as it was at that point, into the river, you have to make sure that you can stop her. Otherwise, she's just going to float into the other bank.
They had to take measures to ensure the boat would not move too far forward as it entered the water. They decided to use 80 tons of chains and anchors to hold the Titanic back and slow its entry into the water.
They are so successful that from completely on land to completely in water, Titanic only moves twice her length. This was the way that they were able to control this elsewise completely uncontrollable event.
The saying is, if a ship can survive its launch, it'll survive anything.
At this point, she is completed as a piece of naval architecture, but there is now the change between converting an ocean-going shell into a floating city.
In June 1911, the hull of the Titanic was taken to Harland & Wolff's fitting out quay. Built specially for these three ships, it was the largest in the world at the time. This is where the interior of the liner would be completed. The Titanic was supposed to be ready for its inaugural voyage just 7 months later. They were running on a very tight schedule. The designers could never have imagined the mishaps that awaited the shipyard. It all began with the integration of the heaviest parts, the beating heart of the ship, without which this giant of the ocean would remain immobile, the propelling machinery. The avant-garde technology of these engines far outweighed their competition.
The Harland & Wolff shipyard and the White Star Line decided to equip the Olympic and the Titanic with a combination of two different types of propelling machinery, reciprocating engines and steam turbines.
They already had turbine technology, they already had reciprocating engine technology, but to combine the two together was unique.
These components were made in the Harland & Wolff warehouses. They were built at the same time as the hull. They were shining examples of technology and human ingenuity.
The engines of Titanic were the largest built at the time, 4 stories tall, triple expansion, 4 cylinders.
The engines in particular are like a model kit. They're built on land, tested thoroughly to make sure that they work, and then they're subdivided into all the major components.
The most iconic elements of the Titanic were its 29 enormous furnaces. Each furnace was 5 meters high, as tall as a house, and designed to consume 600 tons of coal per day during the transatlantic journey. They were the epitome of human ingenuity, reflecting their designers' incredible skill. Making them was a challenge in itself, and installing them on the Titanic was no easier.
It was a very difficult maneuver because the parts were very, very heavy and they had to keep the balance of the ship in mind. So they proceeded with great caution.
Each furnace weighed nearly 20 tons, the equivalent of 20 cars. There was no British crane capable of lifting such a heavy load. That is why the shipyards called on a German company that had perfected a machine unlike any other, the Titan crane. Capable of lifting more than 150 tons across ranges of several meters, this massive metal structure cost the modest sum of 30,000 pounds sterling at the time, the equivalent of 3 million euros in today's money.
The crane is a massive affair. It's got its own power source in order to operate the winches, the jib, or the various gear, and similarly to be able to counterweight the weight of what it's carrying.
It's floating in the water, so it has much more ability to go around the ship as needed and drop things into place.
When the furnaces arrived on the fitting out quay, the Titan crane picked them up and moved them into position for the next step. Each of the parts had to be carefully lowered into the hull through these enormous holes.
When they constructed the hull, before launch, they left large holes through all the decks so that you could lower the engines and boilers into the ship.
There is not a lot of spare room. And so you're getting them into position, hand signals, passing messages backwards and forwards. Eventually they get down into the boiler rooms. Of course, you then have to move them into position.
They had to use incredible precision when operating the crane. They also had to take into account the winds that were pushing the boat around, making the maneuver even more complicated. The risk was that they might damage the interior structure when lowering these monumental parts into place.
You have a huge amount of skill and brute force needed to make sure that they go in just the right place, because there is no room for any error at all.
Once the parts had been lowered into the hold, a new challenge awaited the workers. These parts, each weighing several dozen tons, had to be put into exactly the right place in predefined positions in a very precise order. This rigorous positioning process had a direct impact on the balance of the ship. The designers of the Titanic had planned for a crane to be built inside the ship to move these gigantic parts around.
A small hand crane, mostly intended for maintenance during the operation of the vessel. But ultimately, between that and brute force, you're then piecing the engine back together again and linking it up with the rest of the infrastructure of the ship.
At the same time, many other professionals were hard at work fitting out the interior of the ocean liner. Plumbers, electricians, and carpenters all did their part to turn the Titanic into a floating palace.
On the outside, you're finishing off the superstructure, but inside, you're now making it habitable. You're putting in all of the fixtures and fittings, which are turning what is in essence just a metal box into the luxurious accommodation to rival anywhere on land.
Nearly 2.5 years after construction had begun in the Titanic, it was finally time for the moment everyone had been waiting for: the installation of the funnels. The 4 monumental cylinders were over 20 meters tall, as high as a 6-story building.
They were said to be wide enough for 2 trains to pass each other inside. So this was a massive undertaking. They were built on site, then had to be moved and lifted into place by the giant crane. The funnels also had the distinctive characteristic of being a single piece and arrived on the fitting out quay in one piece. The Titan crane, which the shipyard had bought, was used to move them directly from the quay onto the upper bridge of the boat.
The installation of the funnels was a huge technical challenge. They had to be positioned more than 20 meters above the holes specially designed for them. The smallest error could be fatal.
The worst thing that can happen is if the funnel is dropped when it is being lifted onto the ship, because that would cause enormous damage. You do not want this to go wrong.
The Olympic-class ocean liners had one very interesting distinguishing characteristic. Technically, only 3 funnels were needed to vent the smoke from the engine's furnaces. But it was out of the question for White Star's ships to have fewer funnels than the ships built by their rival, Cunard. So the designers added a 4th funnel and came up with an innovative use for it.
White Star wants to make sure it's at least on a par with its main rival. The 4th funnel, some people refer to it as a dummy funnel, but it did actually have a use. It was for ventilation, also to go down to the kitchens to let the kitchen smells away. So it's not doing nothing. It does have a very distinct purpose.
Inside the ship, the Titanic was starting to take shape. The cabins and living areas were designed around the 15 metallic dividers that spanned the hull from the keel halfway up the boat. In addition to the double bottom, the partitions were an extra safety measure in case of flooding, dividing the ocean liner into 16 completely watertight compartments.
These watertight compartments divided the hull of the boat into a series of compartments that were independent from one another, so that if water were to start coming into one of them, it would only affect one part of the boat rather than the entire structure.
Until the Titanic, ocean liners were able to stay afloat with 1 or 2 compartments flooded. The designers of the Olympic-class liners pushed the limits to the extreme by building ships that would be even sturdier in the case of a disaster.
What are the odds of 3 compartments being damaged? Well, not 2 million to 1. It might be 10 million to 1. The odds go up exponentially the more compartments you add. The Titanic was designed to float with 4 contiguous compartments damaged.
Being designed to cope with such a level of flooding without risking the ship was a remarkable achievement. It's part of the reason why Titanic was known as a lifeboat in her own right. This was pushing maritime safety as far as it had ever gone before at this time.
That's not to discourage people on modern cruise ships. Modern cruise ships cannot float with 4 compartments flooded. Titanic could have.
The Titanic's visionary engineers explored new technical possibilities to push the limits of human achievement to the point of perfection. These dividing walls were obstacles for travelers who wanted to move between compartments on the ship. To solve this problem, they developed watertight doors that used futuristic technology.
These are vertically operating watertight doors with a triple system. They can be operated manually. They can drop straight down if necessary. They're also electrically operated, so they can be closed by remote control from the bridge.
But they also had a flotation device so that if water hit them, they would close. And that way, if the power went out, they would still close in an emergency.
These doors, the pinnacle of naval construction, could also turn out to be an Achilles heel. As a result, their design was the focus of much attention. They had to be perfectly watertight in order for the compartments to fulfill their intended function.
If the watertight doors do not close properly, then the watertight bulkheads are effectively useless because the water can simply flood into other areas of the ship.
The efficiency of these watertight doors and dividing walls would be put to the test on September 20th, 1911, a key date in the construction of the Titanic. The Olympic, which had been in service for 3 months, was beginning its 5th transatlantic crossing from Southampton to New York. On its way out of Southampton in southern England, it came across a Royal Navy ship, the Hawke. Unfortunately, Edward Smith, the captain of the Olympic at the time and future captain of the Titanic, didn't leave the Hawke enough room, and the warship collided with the liner.
The Hawke was a cruiser designed for ramming other ships in combat, so it did a substantial amount of damage. The propeller shaft was damaged, and the Olympic had to turn back.
The collision severely damaged the hull of the ocean liner, tearing a 12-meter hole beneath the waterline. Water rushed into 2 compartments, which were cut off from the rest of the ship when the watertight doors closed in time. Fortunately, there were no passengers in this part of the ship.
It was very impressive because the ship handled the collision very well. The Hawke withstood just as much damage as the Olympic, if not more, so the incident helped prove how sturdy these massive ocean liners were.
So a legend was born. One that Harland and Wolff and White Star do very little to counter. A proposed but never released brochure reading, "So far as it is possible to do so, these 2 wonderful vessels are designed to be unsinkable."
While the proof of the Olympic sturdiness may have been an argument in favor of the White Star Line, this accident only created more work for Harland and Wolff. The ship was taken to Belfast to be repaired in the enormous dry dock known as the Thompson Dock. It was specially designed for these unsinkable boats and was unlike any other dry dock in the world.
The dry dock is an amazing piece of engineering. It looks like a big Titanic-shaped hole in the ground, but it is so much more than that.
It was the only dry dock in the world that could handle ships the size of Olympic and Titanic. It was the only place.
The dock was filled with water to bring the ship inside. Once the boat was in place, the enormous ship door was closed, and massive pumps emptied out the 23 million liters of water in a record time of just 1 hour and 40 minutes. Simultaneously, enormous wooden struts were put in place at precise locations to keep the 52,000-ton ship upright.
And we look at it today and say, that's crazy. But, well, that's where they did it. You had to put them in the right spot because, and many of them, because otherwise, because one, it would punch through the hull, the ship would still keel over.
The directors of Harlan and Wolff had to reassign some of the people who were working on building the Titanic to complete the repairs on the Olympic instead.
It took 6 weeks to repair this steel monster. It cost a total of £100,000, the equivalent of 11 million euros today, a genuine fortune. These repairs had a direct impact on the timing of the Titanic and would have tragic consequences.
They were hoping to do the maiden voyage in March, and they weren't able to do it, and they had to push it out until April. And so it did have an effect on it.
Early advertisements said it was to be in January for the maiden voyage of the Titanic. I wish it had been. There were no loose icebergs in January.
January 1912. The Titanic was nearly finished. In 3 months, it was supposed to be in New York. It was now its turn to be moved into the Thompson dock for the final touches.
As well as that, you're going to paint the ship and you're going to give it its final bits of plumbings and electrics. So Titanic is in the Thompson dock for about 6 weeks.
And now all the finishing touches are made. This includes the installation of the 3 enormous propellers.
The 2 molded steel side shafts weighed 38 tons each. The blades of the propellers were carefully bolted to the boss. The central shaft of the turbine was completely different and very modern. This work of art was a single piece made of a manganese bronze alloy. Installing these shafts was the last challenge facing the builders.
Putting the propellers in place was just as delicate as anything else, if not more so, because there's very little space and you now have a complete ship which you don't want to damage.
April 1st, 1912, the Titanic was preparing for its initial sea trial. A feeling of pride flooded the hearts of the men who had given 3 years of their lives to build this incredible ship. It was a testament to the ingenuity and expertise of everyone involved in the project.
Titanic sea trials are a moment of truth. They need to demonstrate that the ship is fit and seaworthy in all important respects.
On April 1st, the Titanic was supposed to start its trial, but unfortunately, the winds were too high to test the ship properly, so the trials were pushed back by a day.
Just one more delay that would seal the Titanic's destiny as one in a long line of ill-fated ships. But on April 2nd, the weather conditions were optimal. The giant of the seas could finally begin its trial.
It's the first time that the engines of the ship have turned, so it's kind of a grit your teeth moment to make sure that everything is lining up.
It's a feeling of pride and accomplishment for Harlan and Wolff, and there is every prospect that she has a successful and profitable career ahead of her.
And from there, Titanic steams down the coast, heading towards Southampton and her date with destiny.
The day after the trials, on April 3rd, 1912, the Titanic reached Southampton in southern England. It was here that the first passengers of the maiden voyage would board the ship a week later. Inside the ocean liner, the job wasn't finished yet. Many workers were hurrying to make final adjustments before the ship's departure.
There's still bits which need painting. Some cabins aren't quite complete. The heating system in a few second-class cabins ultimately leads to complaints because it's not particularly reliable.
You had to go through and make sure all these things are in place, and if there were any last-minute issues with carpeting that had to be finished being laid, overall just, doing all the touch-up.
Wednesday, April 10th, 1912, the day of departure. The event was celebrated with great pomp by the international media. The Titanic, heavier than the Olympic, was at the top of the podium. It was the single largest ocean liner in the world.
Every kid in Southampton skipped school so they could go down and get somewhere near the dock and watch the ship sail.
As passengers board Titanic at Southampton, there are some concerns lest anything would go wrong with a new ship. But as a crewman said, God himself cannot sink this ship.
The first passengers finally got a peek at this floating palace. The Titanic was unlike any ship ever built before. Its refinement pushed the limits to the extreme. Even the third-class passengers had never seen anything like it.
The passengers had electric elevators, along with very luxurious and comfortable lounges.
You have all of these different provisions to make Titanic a stay on board like being in the finest hotel in the world.
Imagine being on a mission to Mars or something. That'd be the closest thing we can come to today.
12:15 p.m. on Wednesday, April 10th, 1912, the Titanic weighed anchor at the port of Southampton, a day that would go down in history. 5 tugboats escorted away from the dock this Titan, the crown jewel of commercial sailing and pride of the White Star Line and of the Harland and Wolff shipyards. But the event nearly turned into a nightmare.
And as Titanic is passing along the line of moored ships, the suction from her engines, just as with Olympic and Hawke, grabs at the liner New York. New York's mooring ropes split and the ship drifts towards Titanic. There's almost a collision. Smith jumps in, orders full astern on the port engine. They stop with mere yards to go. Not an auspicious start to the maiden voyage.
As it turns out, the New York was the second-to-last obstacle and final warning of the tragic fate that would await the Titanic.